A question I get a lot is, what is seller financing and how does it work? Well, in this video, I'm going to lay out exactly the three kinds of seller financing and how you can make them work from home on properties you don't even yet own. In different market conditions, different strategies work best. So you got to be able to adjust to the market conditions. In an environment where people have to pay 8% interest rates, then getting a new bank loan might not always be the best situation, might not actually be possible. Now, creative finance comes into place here, including seller financing situation. And in this video, I'm going to share with you exactly how you can use seller financing to actually get deals done that you otherwise would not get done, and also how you can use it to make 3 to 5 times as much money on a regular deal that you otherwise would be able to. So stay to the very end, because I actually have an extra surprise for you. There's a few scenarios where seller financing comes in very, very handy. Scenario 1 is an environment where the interest rates are so high that most people can actually not afford a new mortgage. At the same time, if they're faced with sellers that are locked in a house with a 2 or 3%, 2.5 or 3% interest rate, those sellers really don't have an interest in selling their property and actually moving into another property where they now have to pay much more money. Seller financing comes in very handy in a couple of different scenarios. One of them is the following, and that is that if a buyer comes in and he actually can't afford a new mortgage because interest rates have risen so much, then they're basically dead in the water. At the same time, if a seller wants to sell their property, but he doesn't find enough buyers because interest rates are so high for them to get a new loan, then the seller is dead in the water. The only solution for that is really the following. The seller needs to drop the price down to a level where at the new lower price, the mortgage becomes affordable to the buyer. Now, the seller doesn't want to do that because he loses tons of money. So instead of selling a house for $500,000, he might have to drop that price to $350,000 to make that mortgage be affordable again, because thanks to the mortgages going from 3% to 8%, the mortgage on a $350,000 home now is as much as it was on a $500,000 before, actually, or even more. So here's a situation. The buyer can't pay more. The seller doesn't want to drop the price. And that's where seller financing comes in. Because in this scenario, who prevents the seller and the buyer from striking an agreement where the buyer says, hey, Mr. Seller, instead of me going to the bank and getting an 8% loan, why don't I pay you the $500,000 that you want, and instead you give me a 4% loan, and I pay you at a 4% interest rate. Now again, why would the seller do that? Because he's getting his full market value that he wants for the property. He gets $150,000 more for the property, and on top of it, he gets cash flow. Because who knows, that house might not have been the seller's primary residence. That might have been his mom's house. And his mom might have passed away, and now he's inherited this house, and he doesn't want to go drop the price, but he also doesn't need $500,000 cash. Instead, what if he gets a simple, $2,500 a month monthly payment? Would that be nice? It would absolutely be nice. So the seller might be excited about that, because instead of having to drop the price and sell this place for $350,000, he gets his $500,000 price. He gets a down payment of perhaps $50,000 also. He gets some cash, and now he gets $2,500 a month coming into his bank account for years and years and years and years, until either the interest rates drop again and that buyer can now refinance themselves into that house and get his own loan, or until the loan is paid off, which in this case could be 20, 30 years. Or what the seller could do in this case also, he could actually take that note and sell that note. And somebody else might give him $400,000, $425,000 for that note. So either way, the seller has won, because instead of dropping the price to $350,000, he now gets a down payment, he gets cash flow, and he can sell the note for more money. So seller financing, in essence, works such that instead of the buyer going to the bank, the buyer goes to the seller. And the seller says, hey, Mr. Seller, I can't afford to pay that property in full. Would you allow me to actually give you a down payment and make the remaining money that I own, pay that remaining money that I owe back off in monthly payments little by little over the next X years. And again, from the seller's point of view, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, unless you need all the cash. But from a seller's point of view, it's a wonderful thing because the seller gets a down payment, the seller gets cash flow, and on top of it, the seller gets to charge interest on the balance that has not yet been paid off. So the way that I just described is really the first way of doing seller financing. It's a very simple, straight up seller financing strategy where the seller says, yeah, I'll allow you to make a monthly payment and pay the rest off. The way that is different from other ones is really down to what kind of documents do you use. And the first kind of documents you can use, and the first way to do, therefore, seller financing is by using a deed of trust and note. If you use a deed of trust and note, what essentially happens is that the seller actually sells the property to the buyer, gives the buyer a deed for the property. The buyer then gives a deed of trust back, and the deed of trust specifies what happens if he doesn't pay, and then also signs a note. And the note is an IOU, is a document that says, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm going to pay you $50,000 down, and I'm going to make monthly payments of $2,500 for the next 30 years on that property. I can pay it off anytime. There's no prepayment penalty. But if I don't pay, then you can foreclose on it based on the deed of trust, and you can get ownership back of that property. So in that case, the ownership 100% transfers from the seller to the buyer. The buyer now owns the property, and he just has a mortgage or has a loan with the seller. That buyer now pays property taxes, that buyer pays maintenance, that buyer pays everything on it. If something breaks, it's the buyer's responsibility. And if the buyer stops paying, the seller can foreclose on it. If the buyer wants to refinance, he can simply go to a bank and refinance. Simple as that. The exact same thing happens, though, with two other documents. And this actually changes the way, therefore, seller financing works altogether. The basic principle is always the same. A buyer says, hey, I can't afford the property to pay in full. Do you allow me to pay down a part and then pay the rest in monthly payments at X interest rate? It's always the same. What happens now? The second way is that you use a land contract. A land contract is a hybrid between a sale and kind of like a right of use document. And basically, the land contract says, hey, I, as Mr. Seller, I'm going to sell the property to you for $300,000 or $500,000 in the example we said. For $500,000, you give me $50,000 down, you make monthly payments of $2,500 with 4% interest, etc., etc., etc. Lays it all out. But then it says, I will only give you a deed to the property. I will only transfer ownership to the property once you made the last payment. So in essence, this is not two documents. This is one document. And the document combines a sale agreement where it said, I'm selling to you, the seller selling to the buyer, with a financing document, with a foreclosure document. All three are in one document. So it says, I'm selling to you here. Then it says, here is what you pay me. And then here's a monthly payment. And then it says, and if you don't pay me, here's the process for foreclosure. All of that is in one document. It does not have to be recorded in the county. You simply, as the seller, you can simply put it in your drawer, send the buyer obviously a copy of it, put it in your drawer, and then just receive the payments. So for the county records, from the purpose of, from the point of view of the city, the county, the state, the public records, you as the seller continue to own the property. So if there's a coding violation, or if the buyer does something stupid on a property or so, then there's a code violation. That violation gets sent to the seller. So the seller has a little bit visibility of what happens on the property, but bottom line is what the buyer does with each payment, they build up more what's called equity in the property. They build more equity and more equity and more equity, and once they have it all paid up, then they have 100% of the equity and then they get the deed. So why is that ever used, and why is it better or not different than the deed of trust and note? Well, it's better in some cases because several states of the United States, particularly Arizona, Nevada, and a few other ones, have actually specific foreclosure rules that allow you to foreclose on somebody, on the buyer, much faster and much cheaper than you would have to do with a deed of trust and note. Another thing is that because you don't necessarily record it, you stay on title, you get a little bit more supervision of what happens, particularly if you use that for land. That's why it's called a land contract, because it was initially, since the 1970s, used for land more than anything. So as a landowner, you now know what they're doing on the land. Are they doing something that they shouldn't? Do we get code violations? Are they putting a mobile home on there without getting a septic system in place, without having a building permit? Are they building and so on? So you can find out all those things and you have a little bit more control of it. And most importantly, you can foreclose in some cases as little as 3 weeks for $50 and the property is yours. The last one is actually a little bit legal gray zone one. And the last one that's often being done is what's called a lease purchase agreement. And a lease purchase agreement is an agreement where you basically go and you have somebody, they pay you monthly payments as if it was a loan, but the document and everything about the document says that it's a lease. So in this case, what happens, if you sell that property for $500,000, and let's say if you do the calculation that if they make every single payment for 30 years, they'll pay you an extra $100,000 in interest, what you do is you don't sell it for $500,000, you sell it for $600,000, but you don't charge any interest. You basically take in the interest, build it right into the purchase price, and now you say, okay, every monthly payment that you do, $2,500, I'm going every monthly lease payment, because technically it's a lease document. In this case, it's a 30-year lease. And typically that's also used a little bit more for land, but you can do it for houses too. All right, so in this scenario for the lease purchase agreement, let's take a little bit of a different example, and that is of a piece of land. Let's say you're selling a piece of land for $11,000 and you decide to do a lease purchase agreement. So with a lease purchase agreement, what's different is that you're pretending it to be a lease, but at the end, after they made a bunch of lease payments, you still give them the property. That's the basic foundational principle of it. So the way you do that is the following. So under normal circumstances, you would have sold that property for $11,000 with a $1,000 down payment, so that you carry a loan of $10,000. And after everything is said and done and all the interest been collected, you would have received an extra $5,000 in interest. So you would have received $15,000 in payments plus the $1,000 down, that's $16,000. Great. So what we're doing here is now the exact same thing. We're going to go and set up a lease purchase agreement, and we're going to say, hey, Mr. Buyer, we're going to do the following thing. You're going to give me a $1,000 deposit, just like normal when you rent a house, you ask for a deposit too, right? So security deposit, similar thing. So you give me a $1,000 deposit, and then you're going to make payments of $150 a month for the next 100 months. So if you add that up over the next 100 months, they will have paid $15,000, the exact same amount as if you would have done a deed of trust, a note, or a land contract. So far, following me. So as we go through this, they now pay $150 a month. But what you say, since you in your back agreed on a purchase price of $10,000, you're going to say for every $150 that you pay me as lease, as rent, I'm going to give you a $100 credit towards the pre-agreed future purchase price of $10,000. So if they make one payment, you received $150, but now they can buy the property at any time for $9,900. If they made 10 payments, you receive $1,500, and they can buy the property now for $9,000. If they made 99 payments, you received $14,850, and they can buy the property now for $100. And after 100 payments, you received $15,000, the exact equivalent that you would have received if it would have been a normal financing deal, and they can now get the property for $0. And at that moment, you issue a deed to them, and they bought the property, and it's done. Now, why in the world would we go to all this effort? Here's the reason why, and that's why it's a little bit of a gray zone thing. Because by declaring it a lease and calling everything a lease payment and things like that, if that buyer ever stops making payments, you don't even have to foreclose, you only have to evict the buyer. And when you evict the buyer, then obviously in that particular case, there's not much on it, particularly if it's a piece of land, because how hard is it to evict somebody from a piece of land? That's why I only like to use them on pieces of land, because typically when a buyer stops paying, they just disappear. They don't want this property anymore. I don't like using these lease purchase agreements on houses, because if somebody does make those payments on an ongoing basis and they miss a couple of payments and just because of that you can evict them, that's not right. And that's why we don't do it for that. But we are doing it for land. So, because in land, it sometimes happens, particularly in the cheap land, in the bottom end of the land. Particularly a piece of land that indeed you only got them for $500 and you're selling it for $10,000. Using a lease purchase agreement allows you to get a $1,000 deposit, but gets you the same cash flow. But if that person needs to be foreclosed on, if that person stops paying, then now it doesn't cost you $1,500 like it does with a deed of trust and note. It doesn't take 6 months like it does with a deed of trust and note. And as a result, you can actually foreclose, or in this case, evict them very quickly, get the property back, and redo the process again and again. At this point, you might be asking, but Jack, isn't that kind of like unfair to the buyers? And I would give you right. I would say, yes, it is, with the one difference. Our goal is not to foreclose on people. Our goal is to actually keep the cash flow coming. So we, and what we teach, we never ask our students to foreclose after somebody or to evict after somebody missed 1 or 2 or 3 payments. Instead, we follow up and we follow up and we follow up and we call them. We send them letters. It's like, hey guys, you missed your payments. Call us so we can work something out. Because I don't want to have to take this property back. I want to do something. And that is substantially different to some of the people in the housing world. There's people in the housing world that actually use the lease purchase agreement for evil. And they use it in a way that they basically can get a nice down payment from people, a deposit of $10,000 or so. Then they make payments for a few years, then they fall behind, and then they evict them, kick them out, and they do it again. They're doing it for the big fat $10,000, $20,000 down payments, not to help people into their own property, not to help them to fulfill their dream of property ownership. We're doing it to fulfill the property ownership dream. Therefore, when one of our tenants or one of our students' tenants actually stops paying, we reach out. We try to find them again. Fact is just that in land, if they stop paying, they often disappear, and therefore it's easier to then do that eviction, get a property back, and do it again. But in essence, this is how the seller financing works. You can also wrap seller financing around other deals. You can do seller financing with somebody who already has a mortgage and wrap a second one around it, but that's the subject for another video. If you enjoyed that, if you have questions about it, if you want more comments, if you want another video with more details about how this works, make sure you comment below and you give me a follow. Thank you very much and see you at the next video.